The neon lights of Murphy's bar cast a red glow across the rain-soaked street as Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison pushed through the heavy wooden door. The familiar smell of beer, cigarettes, and fried food hit him like a wave of memories. He had been coming to this place for 3 years now, ever since he returned from his second deployment in Afghanistan. Tonight felt different though. Tonight, the weight on his shoulders seemed heavier than usual. Jake's combat boots echoed against the worn wooden floor as he made his way to his usual spot at the far end of the bar. The bartender, Tommy, a Vietnam veteran with graying hair and knowing eyes, looked up from cleaning glasses. Without a word, he poured Jake's usual, a double whiskey, neat. The amber liquid caught the dim light as Tommy slid it across the scarred bar top. "Rough day, Marine?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying the understanding that only came from shared experience. Jake wrapped his fingers around the glass, feeling its coolness against his calloused palms. "Aren't they all?" he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it was a familiar burn, one that reminded him he was still alive, still breathing, still here when so many of his brothers weren't. The bar was unusually crowded for a Thursday night. Groups of young professionals clustered around high tables, their laughter mixing with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Most of them looked fresh-faced and optimistic, probably just getting off work from their office jobs downtown. Jake envied them their innocence, their ability to laugh without looking over their shoulders. At a corner table, 3 women sat nursing their drinks. They looked like they had come straight from work, pencil skirts, blazers, heels that probably cost more than Jake made in a week. One of them, a blonde with perfectly styled hair, kept glancing in his direction. Jake had learned to read people quickly in the military, and something about her attention made him uncomfortable. "Another?" Tommy asked, noticing Jake's empty glass. Jake nodded, his eyes still scanning the room. Old habits died hard. In Afghanistan, situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. Here in a Philadelphia bar, it was just paranoia, but he couldn't shake it. The second whiskey went down easier than the first. The woman from the corner table was approaching now, her heels clicking against the floor with practiced confidence. She had the kind of beauty that came from expensive makeup and regular gym memberships. Her smile was bright, almost predatory. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, not waiting for an answer before sliding onto the stool next to him. "I'm Brittany." Jake's jaw tightened. He had dealt with women like this before, ones who saw the uniform, the muscles, the dangerous edge that came from combat experience, and thought it would be exciting to play with fire. They never understood that some fires burned everything they touched. "I'm not looking for company," Jake said, his voice flat and dismissive. Brittany laughed, a sound like tinkling glass. "Oh, come on. You look like you could use some fun. I saw you sitting here all alone, looking so serious." Her hand moved toward his arm, manicured nails gleaming under the bar lights. "I said no." Jake's voice carried a warning that most people would have recognized and heeded. But Brittany wasn't most people. "Don't be like that," she pursed, her voice taking on a whining quality. "I'm just trying to be friendly. You military guys are always so uptight." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Uptight. If she only knew what keeping that control cost him. If she only knew about the nightmares that woke him in cold sweats, the way his heart raced at sudden loud noises, the constant vigilance that never truly turned off. If she only knew about Marcus. Marcus had been his best friend, his battle buddy, the guy who had Jake's back through 2 deployments. They had enlisted together, trained together, bled together. Marcus had been the funny one, always ready with a joke or a story to lift the squad's spirits during the long, dangerous patrols through hostile territory. The IED had taken Marcus 3 months ago, on what should have been a routine convoy escort. Jake had been in the lead vehicle, Marcus in the second. The explosion had been massive, the kind that left nothing but twisted metal and memories. Jake had pulled 3 other Marines from the wreckage, but Marcus was already gone, his life snuffed out in an instant by an enemy they never saw. The guilt aided Jake every day. He should have switched positions. He should have spotted the device. He should have done something, anything, to save his friend. Instead, he had survived while Marcus became another name on a memorial wall, another letter sent home to grieving parents, another reason why Jake couldn't sleep through the night. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Brittany's voice cut through his memories, sharp and demanding. Jake turned to look at her, and she must have seen something in his eyes because she took a small step back. "I told you I'm not interested. Find someone else to bother." But Brittany wasn't giving up. Her friends at the corner table were watching now, probably daring her to continue, to see how far she could push the brooding Marine. "You know what? You're nothing special. Just another broken soldier who can't handle civilian life." The words were like gasoline on a fire that had been smoldering in Jake's chest for months. The anger, the guilt, the helplessness, the rage at a world that kept spinning while his friends lay dead in foreign soil, it all came rushing to the surface. His vision narrowed, his breathing became shallow, and his hands clenched into fists. "What did you say?" Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Brittany, emboldened by what she mistook for weakness, pressed on. "You heard me. You're just another PTSD case who can't hack it in the real world. Maybe you should have stayed overseas with the rest of the losers." That was the moment Jake snapped. He stood up so quickly that his stool fell backward, clattering to the floor. The noise made several people turn to look, but Jake didn't notice. All he could see was Brittany's smug face, all he could hear were her cruel words echoing in his head alongside the memory of explosions and screaming. "You don't know anything about me," Jake said, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've seen, what I've lost, what I've been through." "Oh, boo-hoo," Brittany shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Poor little soldier boy can't handle a little teasing." Jake's hand moved before he could stop it. Years of combat training, muscle memory built through countless hours of practice, took over. His palm connected with Brittany's cheek in a sharp slap that echoed through the suddenly quiet bar. The sound seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Brittany stumbled backward, her hand flying to her reddening cheek, her eyes wide with shock and outrage. The entire bar had gone silent, every conversation stopped, every eye turned toward them. "You hit me!" Brittany screamed, her voice shrill with disbelief. "You actually hit me!" Jake stood frozen, his hands still raised, his mind slowly processing what he had just done. The red haze of anger was clearing, replaced by a cold, sick feeling in his stomach. He had never struck a woman before, never even raised his voice to one. Everything his father had taught him, everything the Marines had drilled into him about honor and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, lay shattered at his feet. Jake started, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain? How could he make anyone understand the demons that lived in his head, the way the past reached out to drag him back into darkness at the worst possible moments? "Someone call the police!" Brittany shouted, playing to her audience now. "This maniac just assaulted me." Several people were already reaching for their phones. Jake could hear the whispered conversations starting up around him, could feel the judgment in their stares. To them, he was just another violent veteran, another stereotype confirmed, another reason to cross the street when they saw someone like him coming. At the far end of the bar, a woman had been sitting alone, nursing a beer and seemingly absorbed in a book. She had brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, and had been so unremarkable that Jake hadn't even noticed her until now. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not fear, not judgment, but something else entirely. Tommy had come around from behind the bar, his hands raised in a peacekeeping gesture. "All right, everyone, let's just calm down." "Jake, maybe he should what?" Brittany interrupted, her voice growing more hysterical. "Maybe he should get away with assaulting an innocent woman? I want him arrested." Jake felt trapped, cornered like an animal. The walls of the bar seemed to be closing in, the faces around him morphing into the hostile glares he had faced on patrol, the whispered conversations becoming the incomprehensible chatter of foreign voices that might be planning his death. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He knew what was happening, he had experienced panic attacks before, but knowing didn't make it easier to control. I need to get out of here, Jake mumbled, pushing past Tommy toward the door. Oh no, you don't. Brittany grabbed his arm with surprising strength. You're not going anywhere until the police get here. Jake spun around, his training taking over again. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Brittany's wrist and twisted, applying just enough pressure to make her release him without causing real damage. But, to the watching crowd, it looked like another act of aggression. Let go of me! Brittany screamed. That was when the woman from the corner of the bar stood up. She moved with a grace that seemed casual but was actually carefully controlled. Every step was precisely placed, every movement economical and purposeful. As she approached, Jake noticed details he had missed before, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, the alertness in her dark eyes, the fact that she had chosen a seat that gave her a clear view of all exits. That's enough, she said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone in the bar turn toward her. Brittany whirled around, her face flushed with anger and indignation. Mind your own business. This psycho just— I saw what happened, the woman interrupted smoothly. You provoked him. Repeatedly. After he made it clear he wanted to be left alone. So what? Brittany snapped. That doesn't give him the right to hit me. No, it doesn't, the woman agreed, her eyes moving to Jake. But context matters. There was something in her gaze that Jake recognized but couldn't quite place. It was the look of someone who had seen combat, who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. But that was impossible. She looked like a civilian, dressed like any other person enjoying a quiet evening at the bar. Who are you supposed to be, his lawyer? Brittany demanded. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something like that. Jake could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. Someone had clearly called 911, and soon the police would arrive to sort out the mess he had created. He thought about his military record, his exemplary service, the commendations and medals that meant nothing if he was arrested for assault. He thought about his parents, who had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities they never had. He thought about Marcus, and how disappointed his friend would be to see Jake throw everything away in a moment of weakness. I should go, Jake said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. No, the woman said firmly. You should stay. Something in her tone made Jake look at her more carefully. There was steel beneath her calm exterior, a hardness that spoke of training and experience. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jake felt a strange sense of recognition, as if he were looking at a reflection of himself. But, before he could process the feeling further, the bar door burst open and 2 police officers strode in, their hands resting casually on their service weapons as they surveyed the scene. The taller of the 2, a middle-aged man with graying temples, stepped forward. All right, what's going on here? He asked, his voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had broken up more bar fights than he cared to count. Brittany immediately launched into her version of events, her voice rising with each word as she painted herself as an innocent victim of unprovoked violence. She pointed dramatically at Jake, her gestures becoming more theatrical with each accusation. Jake stood silent through it all, knowing that anything he said would only make things worse. He had learned in the military that sometimes the best strategy was to remain quiet and let others reveal their true nature through their words and actions. The officer took notes, nodding occasionally as Brittany spoke. When she finished, he turned to Jake with an expression of professional skepticism. Is that how it happened, sir? The officer asked. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the quiet woman spoke first. Officer, I witnessed the entire incident. I'd like to provide a statement as well. The policeman looked at her with interest. And you are? An uninvolved observer who happened to be sitting right over there, she said, pointing to her corner table. I saw and heard everything. As she began to speak, Jake realized that this woman, whoever she was about to change the trajectory of his entire evening, possibly his entire life. Her version of events was factual but nuanced, acknowledging his actions while providing context about Brittany's behavior and verbal provocations. There was something about the way she spoke to the officers, a confidence and familiarity with law enforcement procedures that suggested she wasn't just an ordinary civilian. But Jake couldn't figure out what made her different, what gave her the quiet authority that seemed to command respect even from the police. All he knew was that when she looked at him, he didn't see the judgment or fear that he had grown accustomed to seeing in civilian eyes. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like understanding. The night was far from over, and Jake had no idea that the woman who was potentially saving him from arrest carried secrets that would make his own struggles seem simple by comparison. He had no way of knowing that her presence in the bar that night wasn't coincidence, that her quiet observations were the result of training that went far beyond anything he had experienced in the Marines. As the officers continued their investigation and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Jake found himself studying the mysterious woman more carefully. Something about her presence made him feel calmer, more centered than he had felt in months. For the first time since Marcus's death, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone in his battle against the demons that haunted his dreams. Little did he know that those demons were about to pale in comparison to the revelations that would unfold over the coming days, and that the woman who had just stepped in to help him carried secrets that would turn his understanding of courage, duty, and sacrifice completely upside down. The police interview took another hour. Officer Martinez, the older of the two policemen, had seen enough domestic disputes and bar fights to recognize the difference between a predator and someone who had simply reached their breaking point. As he listened to witness statements and reviewed the facts, it became clear that while Jake's actions were inexcusable, the situation was more complicated than a simple assault case. The mysterious woman, who had introduced herself simply as Sarah, provided a detailed account that painted a picture of prolonged harassment and deliberate provocation. Several other witnesses corroborated her version, reluctantly admitting that Brittany had been aggressive and wouldn't leave Jake alone despite his clear requests. "Look," Officer Martinez said to Jake as they stood outside the bar in the cool night air, "what you did was wrong. There's no getting around that. But, given the circumstances and the fact that this appears to be your first offense, I'm going to let you off with a warning this time." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by shame. "Thank you, officer. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Martinez replied, his tone stern but not unkind. "I've seen good soldiers throw their lives away over stupid mistakes. Don't be one of them. Get some help if you need it." As the police cars pulled away, the bar began to empty. Brittany and her friends had left in a huff 20 minutes earlier, muttering threats about lawyers and lawsuits that everyone knew would never materialize. Tommy had closed early, claiming he needed to process the evening's events and decide how to handle similar situations in the future. Jake stood on the sidewalk, suddenly unsure of what to do next. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him feeling drained and hollow. The weight of what had almost happened, arrest, criminal charges, the end of any chance at a normal life, settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "You okay?" He turned to find Sarah standing a few feet away, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jeans. Up close, he could see details he had missed in the dim bar light. She was probably in her early 30s, with intelligent brown eyes and a face that was pretty in an understated way. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. "I should be asking you that question," Jake said. "You didn't have to get involved. Could have just minded your own business and let me deal with the consequences." Sarah shrugged. "Didn't seem right. That woman was way out of line." "Still doesn't excuse what I did," Jake replied, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I've never hit a woman before. Never even thought about it. I don't know what came over me." "I do," Sarah said quietly. Something in her tone made Jake look at her more carefully. "What do you mean? You want to get some coffee? There's a diner about 2 blocks from here that stays open all night. Might be easier to talk somewhere that doesn't smell like spilled beer and bad decisions." Jake hesitated. He didn't know this woman, had no reason to trust her, and every instinct told him that getting emotionally involved with anyone right now was a bad idea. But there was something about her presence that made him feel less alone, less like he was drowning in his own darkness. "Okay," he said finally. "But I'm buying. It's the least I can do after you saved my ass back there." The diner was one of those classic American establishments that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and a neon sign that buzzed intermittently. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, poured their coffee without being asked and left them alone in a corner booth. "So," Jake said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug, "you said you knew what came over me back there. Care to elaborate?" Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "You have the look," she said finally. "What look?" "The look of someone who's seen too much. Done too much. Lost too much." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "How long since you got back?" "Afghanistan? About 8 months. But I'd been stateside for 3 years total. Did 2 tours." Jake frowned. "How did you know I was military?" "Lucky guess," Sarah said, but there was something evasive in her tone. "What happened over there?" Jake felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever anyone asked about his deployments. Most people wanted war stories, tales of heroism and adventure that bore no resemblance to the reality of modern combat. They wanted to hear about dramatic firefights and clear victories, not about the grinding anxiety of never knowing when the next IED would detonate, or the way the smell of burning diesel could trigger a panic attack in a grocery store parking lot. "The usual," he said evasively. "Patrols, convoys, trying to help people who didn't always want our help." Sarah nodded as if she understood exactly what he wasn't saying. "You lose anyone close?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He set his coffee cup down carefully, fighting the urge to get up and walk away. Most people, when they asked about casualties, wanted numbers and statistics. They wanted to know about the enemy or insurgents, not about the real cost of war. "My best friend," Jake said quietly. "Marcus. We grew up together, enlisted together. He was." Jake stopped, unable to find words adequate to describe what Marcus had meant to him. "He was killed by an IED 3 months ago. I was supposed to be in his vehicle that day, but I switched at the last minute because of a radio issue." "Survivor's guilt," Sarah said softly. "It wasn't a question." "The therapist at the VA calls it that," Jake replied, his voice bitter. "Has a nice clinical ring to it, doesn't it? Makes it sound like a diagnosis instead of a fact." "What fact?" "That Marcus died because of my decision. If I hadn't switched vehicles, if I had been riding with him, maybe I would have seen the device. Maybe I could have warned the driver, or..." Jake's voice trailed off. "Or maybe you'd both be dead," Sarah said bluntly. "Or maybe the IED was so well hidden that nobody could have spotted it. Or maybe it was command detonated and the timing was pure chance. You're assuming you had control over variables that were completely random." Jake looked up sharply. There was something in her voice, a familiarity with combat terminology and tactical situations that seemed odd for a civilian. "You sound like you know something about IEDs." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I know something about losing people. About feeling responsible for things that were beyond your control." "You lose someone in the military?" "Something like that," Sarah said, the same evasiveness creeping into her voice again. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. The diner was nearly empty except for a long-haul trucker nursing a piece of pie at the counter and a young couple in the far booth who looked like they were having relationship problems. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said eventually. "Shoot. What you did back there, the way you handled the situation with the cops, that wasn't just being a good citizen. You knew exactly what to say, how to frame the narrative. You've dealt with law enforcement before." Sarah's expression became guarded. "Most people have interacted with police at some point. Not like that. You talked to those officers like you understood procedure, like you knew how investigations work. And the way you positioned yourself in the bar, your situational awareness." Jake leaned forward slightly. "What do you do for a living, Sarah?" "I work for the government," she said after a pause. "What kind of government work?" "The boring kind. Lots of paperwork, lots of meetings, lots of bureaucracy." Jake didn't believe her for a second, but he could recognize a deflection when he heard one. Whatever Sarah did for a living, it wasn't pushing papers in some federal office building. Everything about her, from her alertness to her confidence to her ability to read people and situations, suggested training and experience that went far beyond anything a typical civil servant would possess. "Well, whatever you do, thank you again for stepping in," Jake said. "I owe you more than coffee." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied. "But, can I give you some advice?" "Sure. What happened tonight, with that woman, it's going to happen again if you don't deal with what's really bothering you." Jake bristled slightly. "I'm dealing with it. I'm seeing a counselor at the VA, taking the medications they prescribed." "That's not what I mean," Sarah interrupted. "You're treating the symptoms, not the cause. You think the problem is that you can't control your temper, but that's not it at all." "Then, what is it?" Sarah leaned back in her booth, studying him with those intelligent brown eyes. "You're angry. Not at that woman, not at random strangers who say stupid things, but at yourself. At the world. At the unfairness of losing someone you cared about while people like her live their comfortable, ignorant lives without any understanding of sacrifice or loss." Jake felt something twist in his chest. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "You think Marcus would want you to throw your life away because he's gone? Don't." Jake's voice was low and dangerous. "Don't you dare bring him into this." "He's already in this," Sarah said firmly. "He's in every decision you make, every moment of guilt you carry, every time you punish yourself for surviving when he didn't. The question is whether you're going to honor his memory by living a life worth saving, or whether you're going to waste the second chance you've been given." Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I don't need this. I don't need some stranger lecturing me about how to handle my grief. Sit down, Marine." The command in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of giving orders and expecting them to be followed. Jake found himself sitting before he had consciously decided to do so, his military training responding to something in her tone that his conscious mind couldn't quite identify. "Better," Sarah said softly. "Now listen to me. What happened to your friend was a tragedy. What happened to you was trauma. Those are two different things, and you're confusing them. Tragedy is random, unfair, beyond human control. Trauma is what happens to the survivors, and trauma can be healed if you're willing to do the work." "And what makes you such an expert on trauma?" Jake demanded. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the Formica tabletop. When she looked up, there was something different in her eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Because I've been where you are," she said simply. "I've lost people I cared about. I've made decisions that got good people killed. I've lain awake at night replaying scenarios and wondering what I could have done differently. And I've learned that surviving doesn't make you guilty, it makes you responsible." "Responsible for what?" "For making their sacrifice mean something. For living a life that justifies the chances they didn't get to have." Jake studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But all he saw was someone who understood his pain in a way that the VA counselors and well-meaning friends never could. Someone who had walked through her own valley of shadows and emerged on the other side. "You never told me your last name," he said suddenly. Sarah smiled, and, for the first time all evening, it reached her eyes. "Does it matter?" "I guess not. But, if we're going to be friends, I should probably know what to call you." "Friends?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we are?" "I don't know what we are," Jake admitted. "But, you're the first person in months who's talked to me like I'm a human being instead of a problem to be solved or a victim to be pitied." "That's because I don't see you as either of those things," Sarah said. "I see you as a soldier who's fighting a different kind of battle now, one that doesn't have clear objectives or obvious enemies. It's harder in some ways than combat because there's no manual, no training that prepares you for it. So what do I do? You keep fighting. You get up every day and you choose to live instead of just surviving. You find a purpose that's bigger than your guilt.
And, you remember that healing isn't betraying the dead, it's honoring them.
Jake felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, the first he had shed since Marcus's funeral. "It hurts so much," he whispered.
"I know," Sarah said softly.
"But, the pain means you loved him. And, love isn't something to be ashamed of, even when it hurts." They sat in comfortable silence for several more minutes, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like a bridge across their individual pain. Jake found himself wondering about Sarah's story, about the losses she had hinted at and the experiences that had taught her so much about trauma and healing.
"Can I ask you something else?" Jake said finally.
"Sure.
Why were you at the bar tonight?
You don't strike me as the type who hangs out in dive bars on Thursday nights."
Sarah's expression became guarded again. "Just needed somewhere quiet to think." "About what?"
"Work stuff. Difficult decisions, complicated situations." She glanced at her watch and frowned.
"Speaking of which, I should probably get going. Early day tomorrow." Jake felt a stab of disappointment.
He wasn't ready for the evening to end, wasn't ready to return to his empty apartment and the sleepless hours that stretched before dawn.
"Will I see you again?" "Philadelphia's not that big a city," Sarah said evasively.
"I'm sure our paths will cross." As they stood to leave, Sarah pulled out her wallet to pay for the coffee, but Jake waved her away.
"I said I was buying. It's the least I can do."
Outside the diner, they stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite sure how to end the evening. Jake wanted to ask for her phone number, wanted to make concrete plans to see her again, but something held him back. There was still so much about Sarah that remained mysterious, so many questions left unanswered. "Take care of yourself, Jake," Sarah said finally. "And, remember what I said about making his sacrifice mean something."
"I will." "And, Sarah? Thank you. For everything."
She smiled and turned to walk away, disappearing into the shadows between streetlights. Jake watched until he couldn't see her anymore, then started the long walk back to his apartment. He had no way of knowing that Sarah was walking toward a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away, or that the phone that buzzed in her pocket as she reached the car carried a message that would change both their lives forever. He couldn't know that while he was struggling with survivor's guilt and PTSD, she was dealing with the psychological aftermath of operations that couldn't be discussed in any therapist's office, missions that officially never happened, and losses that could never be publicly mourned. Most importantly, Jake had no idea that their meeting in the bar hadn't been coincidence at all, and that Sarah's presence in his life was about to become far more complicated than either of them could have imagined. The woman who had saved him from arrest was carrying secrets that would test everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the price of serving something greater than oneself. As Jake climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. For the first time since Marcus's death, he felt like maybe there was a path forward, a way to honor his friend's memory while still building a life worth living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and revelations that would test that newfound hope in ways Jake couldn't begin to imagine. But tonight, for the first time in months, he thought he might actually be able to sleep. Jake woke to sunlight streaming through his apartment window and the unfamiliar sensation of having slept through the night without nightmares. For the first time in months, he hadn't jerked awake in a cold sweat, heart racing from dreams of explosions and burning vehicles. He lay in bed for several minutes, marveling at the absence of the crushing dread that usually greeted him each morning. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the harsh light of day. Had he really struck a woman in a bar? Had a mysterious stranger really saved him from arrest? Had he actually opened up to someone about Marcus for the first time since the funeral? Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, he wondered if it might be from Sarah, but the number was unfamiliar. The message was brief and formal: report to Building 6, Room 312, Federal Plaza, 10 a.m. Ask for Agent Rodriguez. Jake sat up quickly, his peaceful mood evaporating. Federal Plaza meant FBI or another law enforcement agency. Had Brittany decided to press charges after all? Had the police changed their minds about letting him off with a warning? He tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail without even a greeting. A quick internet search revealed that Building 6 housed several federal agencies, but the directory was deliberately vague about which specific departments occupied which floors. Jake showered and dressed carefully, choosing his best civilian clothes, khakis, a button-down shirt, and the sport jacket his mother had bought him for job interviews. Whatever this was about, he wanted to look presentable and responsible, not like the angry veteran who had lost control in a bar. The morning commute into downtown Philadelphia was a nightmare of traffic and construction, giving Jake plenty of time to imagine worst-case scenarios. By the time he found parking near Federal Plaza, his earlier sense of peace had been replaced by the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. Building 6 was a sterile government complex with multiple security checkpoints and the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made visitors feel guilty even when they had done nothing wrong. Jake presented his ID to the guard, who checked his name against a list and handed him a visitor's badge. "Elevator to the third floor, turn right, room 312, the guard said without looking up.